Welcome to Proving the Point, where we discuss important research papers that you should know about. Today, we're going to talk about this paper called Obesity-Related Microenvironment Promotes Emergence of Virulent Influenza Virus Strains. And so what they did in this paper is they took obese mice and they infected them with influenza virus. And what they found is that in obese individuals, the virus basically mutated to become more deadly. And then if you took that mutated virus and then infected like normal healthy mice with it, they were basically more likely to die from that virus. So what this suggests is that individuals who are less healthy might basically be incubating and promoting the evolution of more deadly pathogens that they then spread out to the broader population. Okay, so the reason this matters, there's a lot of reasons, but one is it means you need to take care of your health as an individual because your own health status impacts those around you in ways that you might not expect. So for example, if you do things that lead you to be metabolically unhealthy or obese, such as like overconsumption or not exercising enough, then what that could do, among other things, is when you get infected by a virus, as evidenced by this paper, that virus might evolve to become more deadly, and then it will spread out to those around you in your environment and then be more deadly for them as well, even though they're not responsible for your obesity. Okay? So it's a message of personal responsibility regarding health. This also has implications for how we handle infectious diseases and how we think about those. So if you remember during COVID, there was a lot of hysteria around the vaccine and people acted like the only way to protect yourself from the virus was to get the vaccine. And if you didn't get the vaccine, you were like a walking health hazard. Okay, well, in my experience, a lot of the people pushing this were not healthy individuals at all. So I was at Ohio State University at the time doing graduate school research on viruses. And I remember very distinctly the people who were pushing for mandatory vaccine and they were trying to get us kicked out of school if we didn't take the vaccine. These were often overweight, unhealthy, dysgenic people who themselves were not healthy. And what papers like this tell us is that unhealthy hosts basically incubate toxic viruses that they can spread around. So in reality, those types of people might be better considered walking health hazards. Okay, so maybe in the future, a better solution to viral diseases isn't forced vaccination of healthy people, but maybe forced healthy behavior of unhealthy people. So maybe we should force these people to exercise and force them to eat right. Another reason that this paper matters is because it has implications for group selection. So from an evolutionary perspective, most people think that the unit of evolution is the individual, where it's basically survival of the fittest individual. But there's also a layer of group selection where it's basically the survival of the fittest groups, where, groups that cooperate and do better, they can outcompete other groups. Well, an important feature of which groups will be better adapted is which groups can better survive infectious diseases. And so what this paper suggests is that if you have a population that contains even just a few unhealthy individuals, they might be incubating more deadly viruses and pathogens that could then spread around the population and basically bring the whole population down, even if there are plenty of healthy people. And so what that suggests is that we need to be looking at our health sort of at a population level. So we can't have this attitude of live and let live regarding people's health, but we need to take a more active role in promoting positive health in not just ourselves, but also those around us. Because again, if other people around us are unhealthy, that can have negative effects on our health through indirect mechanisms like that discussed in this paper. Okay, yet another reason that the paper matters is because a lot of people have this idea that pathogens are like a natural evil. In other words, they have a low view of nature. The idea that because nature has predators and pathogens and disease, that nature is somehow suboptimal and therefore we need to redesign nature in our image, and we need to artificialize everything, including our food supply, including our environment and things like that. In reality, the natural environment is, I think, very optimal in terms of how it affects our health. And things like pathogens, I think they have a purpose, a biological purpose, such as removing unhealthy individuals, potentially removing unhealthy populations as a whole, as I just described. And what this paper suggests is that pathogens, they aren't targeting people or populations at random, but rather they're specifically targeting unhealthy people, therefore acting as like a quality control mechanism. Okay. And so the reason it's dangerous to have the idea that nature is like evil or suboptimal is, again, because that's what leads people to think things like, okay, the only way to protect ourselves is from a vaccine. Nature is just randomly targeting people with its viruses and pathogens. Okay, that's not true at all. And this paper is some evidence against that. Okay, so with that out of the way, we'll get into the paper. So we'll go through some of the background. We'll go through the methods as we go through the results. But they start off by talking about how obesity has long been known to be associated with basically worse outcomes for viral diseases. So they say obesity is associated with increased disease severity during influenza infection, elevated viral titers, that basically just means viral abundance in their exhaled breath, and significantly prolonged viral shedding during infection with influenza A. Okay, so viral shedding is then just them basically emitting the virus, which can then go and infect other people. Okay, so obese individuals are more likely to be super spreaders of the disease. Another interesting concept is, as they talk about here, viruses like influenza are highly mutable, meaning they mutate very frequently. So what a lot of people don't understand is that when you're infected with a virus, you don't just have like one genetically identical virus that has copied itself many, many times. You actually are infected by a pool of genetically different viruses. In other words, you're infected by one initial virus, and then it quickly multiplies to many billions of copies. Okay? And at that point, it is mutated. So all those copies, not all of them, but most of those copies have genetic differences from each other. So you're actually infected by a population of genetically different viruses at that point. Some of which are more deadly than others, some of which are more likely to spread than others. And so what they're asking here is, given that when you're infected by a virus, you're really infected by a population of genetically different viruses, does obesity influence the population diversity of the virus for the infected person? Okay, so we'll get to the results here, but they say, we show that minor variants, that's genetic variants of the virus, rapidly emerge in obese mice. The variants exhibit increased viral replication, resulting in enhanced virulence in wild-type mice. That's basically healthy, non-obese mice. So to translate that, they're basically saying, obese mice, there's a lot more genetic diversity among the viruses that populate them after infection. And some of those genetic variants are basically more deadly than others, and than the initial infected virus. Okay? So they say here, 50% of the adult population is overweight or obese, and these numbers are increasing. And again, they say that obesity basically makes the infection more severe, and it makes greater viral diversity of the virus that infects them. And some of those virus versions are basically more deadly, more pathogenic. All right. So previous studies have linked obesity to worse health outcomes during infection with influenza. They don't really talk about it, but that's true of pretty much every other viral disease too. So obesity suppresses the immune system through multiple different mechanisms that we're not going to get into. But the ultimate effect of this is that obesity is one of the major risk factors for most infections. Okay, so it's very bad for your immune system. Okay, they say here that in diet-induced obese mice, influenza-infected mice have 7 times greater mortality and lung pathology. So that's compared to lean controls, so non-obese mice. So basically, they're 7 times more likely to die from influenza. Okay, so the viral evolution within a host, it's not just related to obesity, as this paper talks about. In other words, it's not just being obese that causes an individual to basically incubate more deadly viruses. There's other factors, such as those related to diet and aging. So regarding diet, so the main virus that I studied in graduate school was called Coxsackie virus. And in mice that weren't given enough selenium in their diet, so there's this micronutrient called selenium. If mice are fed a selenium deficient diet, then the Coxsackie virus basically mutated to become a more deadly version. So depending on what specific vitamins and minerals you eat, that can influence how a virus evolves within your body. It's repeatedly shown to be the case that people who have a poor diet, they're more likely to basically incubate more deadly viruses. So poor diet leads to evolution of viruses that are more harmful. And then again, that will spread beyond just your body to impact those around you. So this is another reason that you need to take care of your diet, because that could harm people around you if you don't. And you need to be sort of enforcing other people around you to have a better diet, because if they don't, that could impact you, because they could incubate a harmful virus that then infects you. Okay, so in order to test the idea here that obesity is causing the evolution of more deadly viruses, they say, we hypothesized that passaging influenza, that's IAV is influenza A, through the obesogenic lung microenvironment would alter viral evolution compared to virus passage through a lean microenvironment. So what they mean by passaging the virus through this microenvironment, they basically just mean infect obese mice with the virus, then isolate that virus a few days later, infect it into another obese individual, isolate it again. All right, that's what's meant by passaging it. You're basically infecting an individual and then harvesting the subsequent viral population from them. Okay, they said they want to do that in both obese mice, and then they want to do it also in lean mice. So they're passaging a separate line of viruses through lean mice to see how that virus population evolves. Okay, and they give a preview of their results here. So they say, we found that serial passaging of a human H1N1 influenza virus through diet-induced obese or genetically obese mice results in a more virulent influenza A virus population versus passage through a lean host. So in other words, whenever you repeatedly put this virus through obese mice, so you put it in an obese mouse, you harvest it a few days later, you put it in another obese mouse, harvest it a few days later, and do that repeatedly, it eventually makes a very virulent influenza population because the virus is evolving and it's mutating. Okay? When you do that in lean mice, it doesn't evolve into as deadly of a strain. Okay. So importantly, they say that even this more deadly strain that evolves in these obese mice, that can infect humans as well. Specifically, they use human cells in vitro, in a petri dish. Okay. So we'll get to those results as we go. But now we're good to move on to the results. So we'll start here in figure 1. So what they did here is they started off by just taking obese mice. So these mice were genetically modified to basically make them more likely to become obese. Okay, so the OB in these charts, that's obese. The WT, that stands for wild type, that's basically just genetically normal mice that are lean and therefore not obese, and they're healthier. Okay. Now, what panel A is showing is this is basically just the abundance of the virus in the lungs of these mice at different hours post-infection. Okay, so again, the blue line, that's obese mice. The gray line, that's lean mice. And what you see is that at 8 hours post-infection, neither group really has that much virus in there because it takes the virus a while to get established. And then the virus levels jump up by 24 hours post-infection, and then they slowly increase. Okay? But there's no real difference in the abundance of the virus in the obese versus the wild-type mice at this stage. Okay? We'll see that changes in future experiments. Panel B, rather than showing the amount of the virus, this is showing like the area that the virus is covering in the lungs. So how much is the virus spreading throughout the lungs? Is the infection localized into one area, or is it spreading widely throughout the lungs? And again, the blue line, that's in obese mice. And what you can see is that, up until 48 hours post-infection, the two groups follow a similar pattern. But by 72 hours post-infection, the obese mice, the infection has spread to a wider area of their lung compared to the wild-type lean mice. Okay, and that's shown in another format in panel C. So this is showing images of their lungs at various times post-infection. And basically the colored image The colored portion of this image is showing where the virus is located and how intense it is. Okay? So really, you want to compare this last time point, 72 hours post-infection. Okay, you see that with respect to the wild-type lean mice, the infection is mostly contained in this one side of the lung, and it's really densely populated with viruses at this one location. But with the obese mice, it's spread more widely throughout the lung, okay? And there's various points where the virus is highly localized. Okay, so basically the virus is able to spread more in these lungs of the obese individuals. So the virus is not behaving the same way in these individuals, in lean versus obese mice. And so the author suggested, well, maybe the virus is no longer genetically identical between the two conditions. So that's what they looked at next. They looked at basically how genetically diverse the virus population is within the lung of an obese individual who's infected versus a lean individual who's infected. And so with panels D and E, that's what they're showing. The y-axis in both cases is basically just the amount of genetic diversity of the viral population infecting those lungs of that group. So here, the first bar, this inoculum, that's just the genetic diversity of the viruses that they initially inoculated into these mice. So this is before it's been infected. Okay, there's low genetic diversity. Mostly it's all genetically identical copies of the virus. Okay, but in obese individuals, I think this is 3 days after infection, they isolate out these viruses and then they analyze the genetics of them. They find that there's much greater genetic diversity in the population of viruses in the obese individual. So that suggests that the virus is undergoing rapid evolution in these obese individuals. Okay, it's less so the case in lean individuals. So still more genetic diversity than the starting virus population had, but it's nowhere near as extensive as in the obese individuals. Okay, panel E, that's showing the same thing except for at different regions of the virus's genome. So we don't really need to get into that. It's more technical than we need to deal with, but basically each of these abbreviations is a different gene in the virus's genome, and it's showing like how much genetic variation is there at that specific gene. Okay, but again, that's sort of beyond what we're interested in here. So the main takeaway from the first figure is the virus seems to be spreading more in obese individuals, and it seems that there's more genetic diversity within the virus population infecting obese individuals. So it's undergoing rapid genetic evolution in obese individuals. Okay, so next they wanted to see like what's the consequence of this genetic evolution of these viruses in obese individuals. Is the virus becoming more deadly? Is it staying the same in terms of its virulence? So what they did is they did a second experiment where the experimental design is described in panel A. They took the virus, which is being indicated by this shape, and they basically infected either obese mice with it or lean mice with it. And at that point, it's the same virus at the start of this experiment. Okay? With the obese mice, they basically passage the virus across different obese mice over time. So they take the first obese mouse, they incubate the virus in the obese mouse for 3 days. After those 3 days, they isolate out the viruses of that mouse, and then they incubate those into another obese mouse. They wait 3 days, then they take the viruses again, incubate them in another obese mouse, and do the same thing a total of 5 times. Okay, so the purpose there is they're basically giving the virus time to evolve to fit the new microenvironment that it's in, namely an obese host. They do the same thing with lean mice. They do it 5 times, taking the same virus, passaging it into a lean mouse, isolating it after 3 days, infecting it into another lean mouse, and doing the same. Okay? They actually did a second experiment with the lean mice in which they did it 10 times rather than just 5. Okay? They didn't do the same thing for the obese mice because eventually, as they kept passaging it for the obese mice, the virus got so deadly that it was like unethical to continue the experiment because the obese mice were just getting completely destroyed by this virus. So the virus was becoming more deadly as it was passaged through these mice. Okay, so then at the end of this, so at basically 5 passages, they took the obese virus population and the lean virus population, and then they injected those into different groups of lean mice. And that's what's being shown in these bottom panels. So in other words, there was a virus population that had evolved in obese mice, and now they were going to inject that into lean mice and see what happened to them. And then there was this virus population that evolved in lean mice, and they were also going to inject that into lean mice to see what happened. And so the results of that are shown in panel B. So what is being shown in panel B, again, the x-axis is time after infection. Okay. The y-axis is basically weight change of these mice. That's relevant because a sign of basically poor handling of a virus is a massive drop in weight, body weight. So basically, if the virus is harming the mouse more, the mouse will lose a bunch of weight. Okay, so the more weight it loses, the worse it's doing. Well, when they took like the same lean mice and injected some of them with the obese virus, the virus that had been incubated in obese individuals, that's the blue line. The gray line is showing lean mice, their weight change when they were infected with viruses that were incubated in lean individuals. So you really want to compare those two bars. Okay, and what you see is that there's greater weight drop in the mice that are infected with the obese incubated virus strain. And what that suggests is that strain is more harmful to these mice. Okay, they show something similar in panel C. So this is a survival curve where each of these different lines is basically lean mice that were infected by a different strain of the virus and how well they do with it. So we could start off with the dotted line up at the top. Those were lean mice that were just infected with the normal initial virus stock, okay? The one that hadn't been mutated yet. And you can see 100% of the mice that were infected with that survived, okay? If you took lean mice and infected them with the virus population that had been incubated for 5 rounds in lean mice, that's the gray bar, okay, about 80% of those mice survived. So still the vast majority of mice are surviving that. But if you inject lean mice with the virus strain that was incubated with these obese mice, okay, the one that evolved to become more deadly in the obese host, they basically all died by day 8. Okay, 100% of them died, 0% survived. So what this means is that the virus that has been passaged through obese hosts was evolving to become so deadly that even when you injected it into lean mice, they all died. Okay, so that's probably the biggest result of this paper. Okay, panel D is showing basically the amount of the virus in the lungs of different strains. So if you infected mice with the initial virus that hadn't evolved at all, okay, it reached this particular abundance level in their lungs. If you injected lean mice with the virus that was incubated in obese mice, okay, it reached much higher levels. And if you infected lean mice with the virus that was incubated in lean mice, it was significantly lower levels than the obese version of the virus. Okay, so again, the obese version of the virus that was incubated in obese individuals, became more virulent, more quickly replicated to higher levels, and was more deadly. Okay, so the main takeaway from figure 2 is just that it is indeed the case that if you passage this virus through obese hosts, it becomes more deadly and it replicates more prolifically. All right, so we can move on to figure 3. What they're showing here is basically that this effect carries on to more than just mice. So what they did in this figure is they basically took canine kidney cells. I don't know why they used that cell type, but basically these are cells that were isolated from a dog, and they're being grown in a petri dish and being exposed to the virus. And in both panels A and B, this is basically showing the abundance of the virus at different time points. depending on which strain the cells were infected with. So again, the blue line, that corresponds to the strain that was evolved in obese mouse subjects. So the obese strain basically reaches higher levels faster than the strain that was produced from incubating it in wild-type lean mice. So again, the strain that was incubated in obese mice was more deadly than the strain that was incubated in lean mice. Panel B shows something similar. So do panels C, D, and E. Okay, we don't need to focus on those. Again, they show that the viruses that were incubated in obese individuals had greater genetic diversity than those incubated in wild-type individuals, but that's basically a redundant finding with what they showed above, so we'll skip this. Okay, for figure 5, we can mostly skip this one too, but this is basically showing, like, what if you, rather than do the passage 5 times through obese individuals, what if you just passage it through twice or 3 times or 4 times? Okay, the answer is it still makes the virus more deadly. So you don't actually need to passage it through 5 different obese mice in order for it to become more deadly. You know, even the second passage, it's already more deadly. But we can skip most of that. With this table, they're basically just looking at specific genetic variants that they detected with their genetic analysis. Again, that's more technical and more detailed than we are concerned with, so we'll skip that also. Figure 6, they're looking into the mechanism of, like, why in obese mice does it promote the evolution of more deadly viruses? And the answer that they come to is basically just that there's immune suppression in obese individuals. So all these panels, A, B, C, D, and E, this is basically showing the activity level of different immune genes. And what you can see is that it's consistently higher in the lean individuals. The gray bar is always higher than the blue bar. What that means is just that there's more immune activity in the lean mice than there is in the obese mice. So the idea is that since in obese individuals there's less immune function, the viruses are basically free to divide and genetically diversify and evolve into more deadly strains. Okay. And then they go on to show that this applies to human cells also. What they did is they took cell samples from obese humans and lean humans. So these are like lung cells. And they found that there's greater immune function in the lung cells of lean individuals. So that's not surprising. It's the same thing shown above for the mice. The interesting part is these panels down here, which is basically, again, if you take these lung cells from obese individuals and lean individuals, again, these are humans now, and you infect them with the virus, basically the virus reaches a higher level in the obese individual's cells. So even in humans, these results seem to apply, where obese individuals do a worse job of handling this virus. Okay, and so that's pretty much the paper. The main takeaway is just, again, if you inject viruses into an obese individual, 1, they don't do as good a job of fighting the virus, but 2, the virus mutates much more quickly in obese individuals, and it specifically seems to select for viruses that are more deadly. Okay, and again, this would then spread out to the broader population. People that the obese individual knows would be affected by this virus potentially, and it would be more deadly in those as well. So again, the fact that obesity is increasing in our population is cause for concern, because not only is it itself a health problem, but it can potentially cause the evolution of pathogens that become a health problem for others. So again, if you want to protect yourself from infectious diseases, there's more that you can do than just get a vaccine. Taking care of your metabolic health is a priority, or should be a priority. Exercise, diet. We'll talk about some other factors that can influence susceptibility to infection in future videos, but it's not just about vaccines. Okay, thank you for listening.